The warship of the Avelari Empire was nothing short of magnificent, a colossal structure gliding through space like a floating palace, its shimmering hull reflecting distant stars. Inside, the three royal daughters, Jayla, Kiri, and Lysara, sat nervously, awaiting the arrival of the human captain Darius Voss. The sisters had been raised on tales of human brutality, of the savage and carnivorous species known for their ruthless nature and hunger for violence. These rumors had filled their minds with fear, and now they were about to meet the very source of those nightmares. The trio sat in an opulent chamber at the heart of the ship, its walls lined with ancient Avelari tapestries, and the floor covered in soft, glowing crystals. But despite the luxury around them, the sisters could hardly relax. They had never met a human before, and the tension was unbearable. Jayla, the eldest, tried to calm her younger sisters with soft words, but even she could feel the dread gnawing at her. Kiri, the second princess, was pacing restlessly, her fiery temper flaring at every sound, her eyes constantly flicking to the door. Lysara, the youngest, stared at the table in front of her, her face pale, her mind racing with questions. What was this human like? Would he truly be the monster they'd been warned about? The door to the chamber opened, and in stepped Captain Darius Voss. The moment he entered, the room seemed to shrink. He was tall, towering over all of them, with a powerful presence that was both intimidating and magnetic. His eyes were a piercing blue, sharp and calculating, and his face, scared from countless battles, held an air of silent authority. Dressed in combat armor, his every move exuded strength and confidence. There was something terrifying about him, but also something that pulled at the sisters' curiosity. As Darius took a step forward, his eyes flickered briefly to each of them, assessing, sizing them up. His gaze was calm, unnerving in its intensity. The room went silent, as if the very air held its breath. The princesses, despite their royal stature, felt small in his presence. He was human, a species they had been taught to fear and loathe, yet here he was, standing before them, as real as any legend. Before anyone could speak, the entire ship shuddered violently, throwing everyone off balance. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and the sound of metal twisting under pressure echoed through the hall. The sisters screamed in shock, but Darius didn't flinch. He immediately reached for his weapon and crouched low, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Get down," Darius barked, his voice a cold command. But it was too late. Explosions ripped through the ship's hull, sending debris and fire cascading through the corridor outside. The royal guards, who had been stationed to protect the princesses, were caught off guard, falling in a matter of seconds. Chaos erupted in the hall as the ship's security systems went into lockdown, but it was clear that the enemy had breached the outer defenses. Jayla's heart raced, her mind struggling to process what was happening. A hostile alien faction had attacked the ship. She could hear the sound of weapons fire growing louder, and the smell of smoke and burning metal filled the air. Their ship, a symbol of the Avelari Empire's might, was under siege. "Stay close," Darius commanded, pulling them toward a nearby hatch. His movements were precise, calculated, as if he had done this 1,000 times. Despite the chaos around them, he was calm, unnervingly so. The sisters, shaking with fear, hesitated for only a moment before following him. The corridors were filled with smoke, and the sounds of the attack grew louder with every passing second. Jayla could hear the rapid thud of footsteps. Enemies were close, and they were closing in fast. Darius led them through the narrow halls, his body tense with anticipation as he checked every corner, every shadow. "Captain, what's going on? Who are they?" Kyrie's voice trembled with both anger and fear. She wanted to take charge, to fight, but the uncertainty of the situation left her paralyzed. "We're under attack by the Tsarkov," Darius replied coolly, his voice betraying no hint of fear. "They've been hunting us for weeks. I'm getting you out of here. Are we going to die?" Lysara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had never known true danger before, and the realization that they could perish here, on this strange world, was almost too much to bear. "Not today," Darius said. "Give." As they continued running, the ship's hull groaned, and another explosion rocked the walls. The sisters could feel the vibrations under their feet, the sense that the entire vessel might fall apart at any moment. Panic set in. What if they didn't make it? What if this human, despite his fierce exterior, couldn't save them? Suddenly, a screech echoed from behind them. A group of alien soldiers, masked in black armor, emerged from the smoke. They advanced quickly, their weapons raised. The princesses froze, but Darius didn't. "Get down," he growled, his tone unyielding. Without hesitation, he pulled out a sleek metallic device from his belt, pressing a button. The device hummed to life, and in an instant he was gone, blending into the shadows. The sisters could barely track his movements as he activated a cloaking field. The alien soldiers looked around in confusion. They could hear Darius, but they couldn't see him. His cloaking device made him almost invisible, but the sounds of his footsteps, the slight disturbances in the air, betrayed his position. With swift, precise movements, Darius dropped from the ceiling, taking out the first alien soldier with a single blow. His combat style was brutal yet efficient, like a predator toying with its prey. Jayla's breath caught in her throat as she watched him in awe. He wasn't just strong. He was a master of war, a terrifying force of nature. His movements were fluid, deadly, and every strike he made left an enemy falling to the ground in a heap. In seconds, the soldiers were dispatched. The hallway was silent again, save for the soft hum of Darius's cloaking device. "Move," Darius ordered, reappearing from the shadows. He wiped the blood from his blade and gestured for them to follow. "We don't have much time." The sisters were stunned. They had just witnessed a display of skill and power unlike anything they had ever seen. Darius wasn't the monster they had been warned about. He was something else entirely. A human, yes, but one who was capable of fighting against an enemy they could barely comprehend. As they moved deeper into the ship, Jayla couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. She was terrified, yes, but there was also a growing sense of admiration for this human soldier who had single-handedly taken down the attackers with such precision. There was no denying it. Darius Voss was not what she had expected. He was a force to be reckoned with, and for the first time in her life, Jayla felt both afraid and intrigued by the mysterious human who was now their only hope. The sisters exchanged glances, their fear slowly melting away, replaced by an uncertain curiosity. They had been taught to fear the humans, to see them as savage beasts with no honor. But now, in the midst of this terrifying crisis, they were starting to realize that the truth was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. They had feared him, but now they were beginning to understand that Captain Darius Voss might just be the one who would save them all. The warship groaned under the assault as it plummeted toward the surface of a hostile planet. Jayla, Kiri, and Lissara had no idea where they were or what was happening. The ship, once a symbol of the Avelheri Empire's might, was now nothing more than a wrecked hulk, spiraling uncontrollably through the atmosphere. The air outside burned with the friction of entry, and the ship's metal hull screamed in protest. Darius Voss, the human captain they had only just met, was the only one who seemed unaffected by the chaos. Calm, collected, and unfazed, he barked orders as he expertly guided them to the nearest escape pod. The sisters, still dazed by the explosions and panic, followed his every move. "This is bad," Darius muttered to himself as he checked the pod systems. "But it's not over yet. Everyone in now." The princesses didn't hesitate, scrambling into the pod as Darius sealed the hatch. Moments later, the pod was ejected from the ship, rocketing toward the planet's surface. The sisters could feel the violent shake of the pod as it tore through the atmosphere, the heat pressing down on them, suffocating. Through the small viewport, the alien world below seemed to rush up toward them like a tidal wave of darkness. Darius didn't respond at first, his focus solely on the control panel, his fingers flying over the buttons with practiced speed. "Hold on," he finally said, his voice low and steady. "We'll make it." The pod hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, and everything went dark. When Jayla awoke, the first thing she felt was the cold, damp ground beneath her. She groaned, pushing herself up. The crash had been brutal, but the pod had somehow held together. The sisters were alive. But where were they? They had landed in a dense jungle, the air thick with the scent of strange flora and the buzzing of unseen creatures. The sky above was filled with swirling clouds and alien moons, casting an eerie light across the landscape. Massive trees, their trunks covered in strange, glowing vines, towered above them. Jayla stood, shaking the dizziness from her head. Kiri and Lysara were already on their feet, eyes wide with disbelief. "Where are we?" Lysara whispered, her voice trembling. "I have no idea," Jayla answered, scanning their surroundings. "But we need to stay close and stay quiet. We don't know what's out there." Just then, Darius appeared from the trees, his silhouette cutting through the thick jungle fog. He didn't look surprised to see them awake. His face was set in a grim expression, his eyes scanning the horizon. His military training had already kicked in. There was no panic in his movements, no hesitation. He had survived worse. "We've crashed on a hostile planet," he said simply. "It's crawling with predators and enemy soldiers. I've got survival gear on me, but we need to move." "Why are you helping us?" Jayla blurted, her voice edged with suspicion. She hadn't forgotten that she and her sisters were royal Avelari princesses, and humans weren't exactly known for their kindness toward the Avelari Empire. The princesses had been raised on stories of human savagery, the brutality of their species. Yet here was Darius Voss, putting himself at risk to protect them. Darius met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'm not doing this for you," he said bluntly. "I'm doing this to survive. If you three die, then I don't get paid and I don't get out of here. So, for now, we're allies. But that doesn't mean I trust you." His words were blunt, but they carried a certain truth that made Jayla's stomach twist. She had expected him to lie, to claim he was helping because of some deep moral code or because of their royal status. But instead, he was honest. He was only helping because it served his own interests. And yet that didn't lessen the fact that he was still their only chance at survival. They moved quickly, keeping low and staying quiet as they navigated through the jungle. The world around them was alive with sounds. Alien creatures howling in the distance, the rustling of foliage as something large moved through the underbrush. Jayla could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of something dangerous lurking just out of sight. But Darius led them with confidence, his movements quick and deliberate. He wasn't scared. He knew what he was doing, and that gave the sisters a strange sense of security. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sisters were exhausted, the adrenaline of the crash wearing off, leaving them feeling vulnerable and scared. They stopped to rest near a small clearing, where Darius set up a makeshift camp. The fire he built was small, but it cast enough light to illuminate the faces of the princesses, all of whom were staring at him with a mix of awe and suspicion. "You really know how to survive," Kiri said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She hadn't expected to say anything nice to a human, but seeing Darius's calm and ruthless efficiency had changed something in her. He wasn't like the monsters they had been warned about. Darius looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's my job," he said simply. "I've been through worse." But despite his stoic response, Jayla noticed something else in his eyes. There was a flicker of something deeper, something that made her heart race and her stomach flip. She couldn't place it, but it felt like more than just survival instincts. Was it concern? No, that couldn't be it. He was a soldier, a mercenary. He wasn't supposed to care. As they sat by the fire, Jayla found herself watching Darius more than she meant to. There was a strange heat that lingered in her chest whenever he was near, an unexplainable pull that left her feeling confused. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to focus on something else, but her mind kept drifting back to him. Then, a massive shape emerged from the trees, its form barely visible in the low light. It was a mechanical beast, easily 10 feet tall, its body made of gleaming metal and its eyes glowing a fierce red. The beast was armed with massive guns, its movements slow but deliberate. Darius's expression hardened. Without a word, he stood up, his hand moving to his weapon. The sisters instinctively backed away, fear rising in their chests. Darius, however, seemed unaffected. He reached for a small device at his side, pressing a button. The world seemed to distort around him as his body vanished, cloaked in the same technology he had used earlier. The sisters watched in shock as the invisible human moved toward the beast, his movements swift and calculated. They could hear the faintest rustle of his cloak as he approached, and then, without warning, he attacked. Darius moved like a shadow, his body flicking in and out of visibility as he tore through the robotic creature's defenses. The machine fired at him, but it was futile. Darius was too fast, too skilled. With one final strike, he ripped through the beast's core, sending it crashing to the ground with a loud explosion. When the smoke cleared, Darius reappeared in front of them, his cloak dissipating like mist. The sisters stared at him, wide-eyed and in shock. They had just witnessed him defeat a war machine with nothing but his strength and his wits. For a moment, there was only silence. That, Jayla whispered, her voice filled with awe, was incredible. But even as she spoke, the lingering question remained in her mind. Why was he doing this? Why was he risking his life for them? For alien royalty? Was it really just about survival? Or was there something else? The sisters couldn't be sure, but the heat in their chests when he was near only seemed to grow stronger. The dense jungle stretched endlessly before them, thick trees and overgrown foliage creating an impenetrable barrier. The air felt heavy with moisture. Each step they took seemed to deepen the silence around them, a silence that was as unsettling as the unknown world they now inhabited. The crash had torn their worship apart, and now, with no way to contact their empire, they were at the mercy of the planet's dangers. The once mighty HFY princesses were no longer in control. They were vulnerable, lost, and the only thing standing between them and certain death was the human soldier who had come to their aid. Darius Voss led them through the wilderness, his every step purposeful, his senses sharp as he navigated the harsh terrain. The sisters followed, staying close but still filled with skepticism. They had heard the stories. Humans were brutal, savage creatures. Their empire had spent years dehumanizing them, spreading rumors about their monstrous nature. But Darius was proving to be something else entirely, a different kind of human. And as they spent more time with him, a strange mix of emotions began to bubble up inside the princesses. Lysara was the first to show signs of softening toward Darius. She had been injured during the crash, a deep gash on her leg that made her limp. It wasn't life-threatening, but it made their journey all the more difficult. Darius had insisted on treating her wound. At first, the princesses had expected him to act out of duty, perhaps with cold efficiency. Instead, he was gentle, his hands careful as he cleaned and bandaged the cut. Lysara had winced slightly, but Darius never flinched. His attention was focused entirely on her injury, his brow furrowed as he worked quickly to ensure the wound would heal properly. His words were few, but there was a kindness in his actions that disarmed her completely. "I've seen worse," he muttered, his voice a low rasp. "You'll be fine." It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. There was something in his eyes that spoke volumes, a strange empathy, a care she hadn't expected from someone she had been taught to fear. Kiri, ever the skeptic, watched the scene with suspicion. There had to be a reason. There had to be some trick behind his kindness. Humans didn't help without a motive, did they? Still, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder if Darius's care for Lysara was genuine. And as they continued through the wilderness, she began to... When they were ambushed by a wild alien predator, Darius had acted before the sisters even knew what was happening. The beast, a monstrous creature with glowing red eyes and sharp claws, had lunged from the trees, but Darius had been faster. He had thrown himself between the creature and Kiri, taking the full force of the attack, pushing her to safety. Kiri had been frozen in place, but Darius's words snapped her out of it. "Move!" he yelled, his voice hard and commanding, and she scrambled to her feet, running for cover. The beast had focused on Darius, but he didn't hesitate. He was a blur of motion, moving like a trained predator himself. With a few precise moves, he had incapacitated the creature, knocking it out cold with a well-placed strike. As it collapsed to the ground, Darius stood over it, his breath steady, his face stoic. Kyrie's heart pounded in her chest, both from the shock of the attack and the way Darius had protected her without a second thought. She had expected him to let her fend for herself, but he had done the exact opposite, and it wasn't just this one time. In every encounter, whether it was an ambush or a dangerous creature, Darius had shielded them. He had risked his life again and again without a hint of hesitation. Later, as they continued their journey, Darius paused and turned to Jayla, holding up a strange human weapon. A sleek, metallic object that seemed more advanced than anything they had in their arsenal. It was small, compact, and held an aura of deadly potential. "Ever used one of these before?" Darius asked, his voice casual, as if asking if she knew how to use a simple tool. Jayla shook her head. She had no use for such things. As a princess of the HFY Empire, weapons were not her concern. But in this moment, stranded on a hostile world, she realized she needed to adapt if she was going to survive. "No," she replied, her voice reluctant. "Then I'll show you," Darius said, his tone changing slightly. It was no longer just about survival. Now it was about teaching her how to defend herself. With steady hands, he walked her through the steps. He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to aim it, and most importantly, how to fire it. Jayla's fingers trembled as she held the weapon for the first time. It felt unnatural, a foreign object in her hands. But as Darius patiently instructed her, her confidence began to build. Slowly, she grew comfortable with it, her initial hesitation giving way to a sense of determination. "You're a quick learner," Darius commented, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Jayla wasn't sure if he was talking about the weapon or something else. Kiri watched them from a distance, her arms crossed. There was something unsettling about the way Darius interacted with her sisters. He was teaching Jayla how to fight, protecting Lysara, and showing a strange kindness that no one had ever told them to expect from a human. But the warmth in his gaze when he looked at Jayla stirred something inside Kiri. She couldn't explain it. It made her uneasy, and yet she couldn't deny that a part of her wanted to be the one he cared for. The growing attraction between the princesses and their protector was undeniable. Each moment spent with Darius, each act of bravery, each unexpected kindness was drawing them closer to him. They couldn't explain it. They were supposed to fear him, to despise him, to keep their distance, but somehow that was becoming impossible. That night, as they made camp by a small stream, the sisters gathered around a fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound that filled the air as they ate in silence, still processing the strange new reality they were now part of. Suddenly, a soft whirring sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder. Darius's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. The sisters tensed, their bodies instinctively drawing closer to him. He was alert, his hand hovering over the weapon at his side. "Drone," Darius muttered under his breath. They found us. The realization hit them all at once. They weren't alone. The enemy had tracked them, and the drone was just the first of many threats they would face. Darius's eyes flicked to the sisters, his face grim. As they hurriedly packed up their camp, Jayla could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The drone, though silent, was a signal that the enemies were closing in. There was no time to waste. Darius was the only thing standing between them and their certain death. The sisters could only hope that Darius's strength and skill would be enough to keep them alive long enough to escape the planet. But deep down, they realized that their survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about trust. A trust they were beginning to place in the human who had so unexpectedly become their protector. From years of neglect. The once bustling military base had long been abandoned, now reduced to little more than a hollow shell. Yet, for all its bleakness, it offered the promise of a chance for the princesses to contact their empire and call for help. They had been stranded on this hostile world for days, battling both the elements and relentless enemies. This outpost, isolated though it was, could offer them the hope they so desperately needed. But little did they know, this would also be where their greatest betrayal would unfold. Darius led them to the communication console, his sharp eyes scanning the environment for any signs of danger. "Stay alert," he instructed, his voice calm but carrying the weight of urgency. His hand moved expertly across the broken control panel, coaxing the old system to life. It sputtered and flickered, but after a moment, it hummed to life, showing signs of a signal. Jayla's heart beat faster. This was it. This was their chance. Their people would come for them. They would be saved. But as Darius worked, there was a lingering sense of unease in the air. The sisters, ever vigilant, kept their eyes peeled for anything out of place. They knew how dangerous this planet was, and in this moment, they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The signal began to broadcast, and the sisters exchanged hopeful glances. This would be the turning point. But just as they started to feel a glimmer of relief, something went wrong. The faintest crackle came through the speakers, followed by an eerie silence. Darius's hand froze. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath. His eyes darted to the screen, and it was then that they all saw it. The signal had been intercepted. The realization hit them like a thunderclap. Their distress signal had been captured, but not by the HFY Empire. Instead, their enemies had taken it, and they knew that meant one thing. They were no longer allies in this fight. The princess's empire had abandoned them. The realization that they had been deemed expendable, a liability in the eyes of their own people, was a bitter pill to swallow. The sisters exchanged glances, horror dawning in their eyes. They had been sent here, stranded on this hellish planet, only to be cast aside when they were no longer useful. "Did they?" Kiri began, her voice barely a whisper, her words trailing off in disbelief. "Did they just leave us?" "It looks like it," Darius replied, his voice steady but tinged with an anger that he kept well controlled. He clenched his jaw, his fists tightening. "You've been abandoned, and your empire has decided it's better to eliminate the liability rather than risk it." The word eliminate hung in the air like a death sentence. The sisters couldn't comprehend it. How could their empire, the one they had fought so hard to protect, just turn their backs on them? But before they could process their shock, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The sound of engines roared in the distance, followed by the sharp hum of weapons charging. Enemy soldiers had arrived. The outpost, which had once seemed like their salvation, now felt like a trap. The sisters' blood ran cold. Their enemies had come in overwhelming numbers. This wasn't just a few rogue soldiers. This was an invasion. The outpost, once a safe haven, was now their final stand. Darius didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, his weapon clicking into place with precision as he activated his cloaking device. He disappeared from view, the shimmer of his invisibility field barely noticeable against the backdrop of the ruined structure. The sisters stood frozen for a moment, not knowing whether to follow or remain behind. But they had. "I won't let them take you." Darius's voice came through their comms, cold and calm. "Stay close to the walls. Move fast. They'll be coming for you." And then he was gone, vanishing into thin air. The sisters exchanged a quick look before scrambling into action. They ran along the edges of the outpost, their hearts pounding, listening to the sounds of enemy soldiers approaching. Darius moved with terrifying precision, dispatching the first wave of attackers with ruthless efficiency. His cloaking device rendered him nearly invisible, and his enhanced weaponry made quick work of the alien soldiers. The sisters, still reeling from the betrayal, tried to keep up, but they were slower, less experienced. The truth hit them like a shockwave. Without Darius, they would have been powerless. The fight, however, was not in their favor for long. Enemy reinforcements flooded the outpost, and the odds shifted dramatically. Darius fought back fiercely, his movements a blur of calculated violence. But even with his skills and advanced weaponry, he was only one man against an army. The sisters could hear him, the sounds of blaster fire and the clashes of battle, and with each passing moment, the hope that they could survive began to fade. Then the skies darkened, and the ground trembled again. It was impossible to ignore the ominous rumble from above, the sound of something massive descending from the atmosphere. The sisters looked up just in time to see a brilliant flash of light. The enemy had called for an orbital bombardment. The first of many strikes hit the planet's surface, exploding in violent waves of energy. The force was so immense, it shook the ground beneath them, sending shockwaves that knocked them off balance. The sisters stumbled, fear gripping their hearts as the sky turned an eerie shade of orange. "This is it," Carrie whispered, her voice trembling. "It's over." But Darius didn't back down. Through the haze of smoke and chaos, his voice came through their comms again, steady and resolute. "We don't give up. Not yet." The sisters could hardly believe it. After everything they had endured, after the betrayal from their own people, Darius was still fighting. He was still willing to risk everything for them. His words, though simple, cut through the hopelessness. They had been abandoned, yes, but Darius was not going to let them fall. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice firm as he reappeared, his cloaking device failing for just a moment as he dashed toward them. His body moved with a speed and power they had never seen before. His weapon was a blur of energy, taking down enemy soldiers with calculated precision. He fought with everything he had, pushing his limits as the bombardment raged on. "We need to move," he shouted over the noise of the explosions, grabbing Jayla by the arm and pulling her toward a safer location. Now, with Darius leading the way, the sisters found the strength to move. They ran, dodging debris, crawling through the rubble as the bombardment continued to rain down. Each step felt like an eternity, each explosion like a hammer to their hearts. The sisters were exhausted, their bodies battered and bruised, but they kept moving. Darius's resolve had become their own. They couldn't give up now. They couldn't die here. As they moved deeper into the ruins, they could feel the heat from the ongoing bombardment, the very ground beneath them trembling from the force. But Darius, ever the leader, kept them focused. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We're not done yet. We're not giving up." The princesses, though terrified and disheartened by the attack, began to draw strength from Darius's unyielding determination. Their fate no longer rested in the hands of their empire, nor in the hope of rescue. It rested in the hands of the human soldier who had given them something they hadn't expected: hope. The battle was far from over, but as they ran for cover, with explosions lighting up the sky around them, they knew one thing for certain: Darius would not let them die. And as long as he fought by their side, they would fight too. The fight raged on. The air was thick with smoke, the ground trembled beneath the intensity of the bombardment, and explosions continued to shake the once mighty human outpost. Darius and the three princesses of the Avelhary Empire were running out of time. The enemy had them surrounded, and they were becoming increasingly overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Each second that passed felt like an eternity. But despite the chaos, Darius remained unshaken. His eyes burned with determination as he fought fiercely, every move calculated, every strike precise. His strength, resilience, and Jayla, Kiri, and Lysara were still in shock from the overwhelming events that had unfolded. Their empire had abandoned them, and they were now trapped on a hostile planet with no hope of rescue, except for Darius. The human soldier, whose reputation had once filled them with dread, had become their savior, their protector, and their anchor in this storm of violence. But no matter how strong he was only one man, and the enemy was relentless. The sisters fought alongside Darius, their hands trembling as they fired weapons they had never dreamed of using. Their alien physiology made them stronger than most, but they were still out of their depth in this brutal conflict. As they moved, they could see how Darius was starting to falter. His movements were slowing, his once quick reactions now a fraction too late. There was something wrong, something terribly wrong. "Darius," Kiri called, her voice filled with panic. She had been by his side for hours, helping him fight off wave after wave of enemy soldiers, but now she could see the blood staining his clothes. It wasn't just a scratch, it was a deep, devastating wound. "You're hurt. We need to get you out of here." He turned to her, his face grim but determined. His cloak shimmered faintly, just enough for her to catch a glimpse of his battered form. His armor was dented, scorched, and covered in dark red streaks of blood. "I'll be fine," Darius said through gritted teeth, his voice as steady as ever. "But you need to go. Now, get to the transport bay. I'll hold them off." "No," Jayla interjected, stepping forward, her voice fierce. "We're not leaving you behind." Lysara, usually quiet and reserved, nodded in agreement. "We don't abandon our allies." But Darius only shook his head, a sharp pang of pain crossing his features as he steadied himself. "I'm not your ally, princess. I'm the one who keeps you alive. And right now, the only thing that matters is making sure you three get out of here. I'll hold them off as long as I can. You don't stand a chance if you stay with me." The sisters stood frozen, a surge of emotion rising within them. They had never known humans to be selfless. Their entire race had been painted as savage, brutal, and unfeeling. Yet here was Darius, a man who had fought tirelessly for their survival, asking them to leave him behind to die alone. Their hearts ached at the thought. "We won't leave you," Jayla said, her voice breaking, her fists clenching around the weapon she held. "We're staying with you, Darius. We'll fight together." For a moment, there was silence between them. Darius's eyes searched theirs, his expression unreadable. Then, as if accepting the truth of their resolve, he nodded, a small grim smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "Then we fight together," he said quietly. "But we have to make this quick. If we don't, we'll all be dead." Darius's plan was simple but dangerous. He knew that the outpost still had some old defenses, automated turrets, force fields, and a few hidden weapons caches. With his cloaking technology and their combined strength, they might be able to turn the tide. But it was a gamble, a desperate one. And if it failed, they would all be lost. The sisters were ready. They had fought with Darius before, but now, they would fight like never before. There was no turning back. As the enemy continued to close in, they took their positions, moving swiftly and silently, relying on Darius's cloaking device to conceal their movements. Darius gave them a final, piercing look, his face hard and unyielding. "On my mark," he said. "When I activate the turrets, you take the left flank. I'll handle the right. Don't hesitate." Without another word, he vanished from view, his cloaking device kicking in once more. The sisters quickly followed his instructions, preparing themselves for what was to come. The enemy soldiers had no idea what was about to hit them. The first shot rang out. It was loud, sharp, and impossibly fast. The automated turrets on the outpost's walls had been reactivated, and they opened fire on the enemy forces, cutting them down with deadly precision. The sisters moved with purpose, firing their weapons, cutting down anyone who dared to